Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you're watching this. Hello. I'm stood up for this one. I was considering sitting down. I don't think you have to be stood up to be preaching. I don't think it's more spiritual. It's just so that I can see my notes. So I just thought I'd explain that decision for you. And we're going to be looking at Exodus 3. Exodus 3, and we're carrying on looking at the life of Moses. And let me read Exodus 3 to you. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry, because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I, that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? He said, But I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you, that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Then Moses said to God, If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent you. God also said to Moses, Say this to the people of Israel, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob has appeared to me, saying, I have observed you, and what has been done to you in Egypt, and I promise that I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. And they will listen to your voice, and you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us, and now please let us go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do in it. After that he will let you go. And I will give his people favour in the sight of the Egyptians. And when you go, you shall not go empty. But each woman shall ask of her neighbour, and any woman who lives in her house, for silver and gold jewellery, and for clothing. You shall put them on your sons and on your daughters, so you shall plunder the Egyptians. Amen. Lord, help us to understand what your word is saying to us. Would you bless our time discussing this passage, and would you bless what your servant has to say now. Amen. So we've seen Moses born, we've seen him witnessed the cruelty that his Hebrew brothers and sisters were going through in slavery. He tried to intervene, didn't he? And he ended up killing someone. And he's run away, he's escaped to Midian, and that's where we join him today. He's joined this family. He's met this family, Jethro. He's called the priest of Midian, and he's married his daughter, Zipporah. And Jethro has given him this job. He's in the family business. He's a shepherd now, and Moses has done this for 40 years. 40 years of shepherding. Not doing much then. Not worth writing about anyway, because none of the things that have happened in these years are written in our Bibles until this point. He's leading his flock of sheep out in the wilderness when he sees a fire. Now, it was a hot part of the world, so this wouldn't have been the first time Moses had seen a fire on his daily rounds, but he goes to see it and he notices something different. He notices that the fire is in the bush, but the bush is not being burnt up. And verse 2 says, "The angel of the Lord appeared to him in the fire." This is God himself speaking to Moses. And this is a story, if you've been around churches, if you've been in this church for your whole life, or even just a long amount of time, then this is a story that you'll be well aware of. It's a Sunday school classic. But I want us to look afresh at this story and to see what it tells us about both God and about man. And I want to look at it through the phrase, I am. So first of all, I want to look at the identity of man. The identity of man. Moses approaches the burning bush and is told there in verse 5 that he should take his sandals off. And you can see as he hides his face there in verse 6, there is a clear indication, isn't there, that he is an unworthy man. This is someone who is walking into the presence of someone great. Similar to Isaiah, when he sees God's glory, he can't speak. He is overcome with the holiness of God. Moses was going to be this great leader of the people. We know that, but he doesn't know that yet. And so we have this amazing opportunity to see God calling Moses. But Moses has huge concerns about his identity. When God calls him, we see Moses' very honest response. Look at verse 11. Who am I? Moses does not think he is up to the task. I'm sure we would react the same way. What does God want to do with me? Who am I that God would want anything to do with someone like me? So let's quickly look at 3 lies that we tell ourselves that blind us from seeing God as we ought. 3 lies about our identity. The first of these is, I am what I do. We wrap ourselves in what we do. What's the first thing we ask someone after we ask them their name? What do you do? For some, that is debilitating, isn't it? It can humble us. For Moses, he was a simple shepherd. That's what he'd done for 40 years. It wasn't cool or glamorous or powerful. A quite straightforward and humble job. He looked after sheep. Part of a family business. For him, it meant that he couldn't possibly see how God could use him. He was wrong to think like that, because God can use anyone he wants to. God can use us regardless of what we do. And I'm sure Moses felt a bit sheepish when God told him to lead the people. On the other side of things, some people cannot wait to tell you what they do for a living. Their jobs are the most important thing. It defines them. And again, we mustn't let this be the case. We mustn't see our job as our identity. This past week has seen people unable to work a lot of the time. The world has kept going despite people not going into work. Things don't fall apart when you're not there. You may be the most amazing plumber or teacher or nurse or tree surgeon, but when you retire, at best, you may get a cake in the staff room and people will throw you a little party. But they're probably not going to build a statue in your honour or give you a building named after you. And even if they did, you'd soon be forgotten by the next generation, I'm sorry to tell you. You see, you are not what you do. That isn't where your identity lies. You are more than your LinkedIn profile. You are more than your job. You are more than your GCSEs. You are more than your university degree. You are made in the image of God, and He would love for you to be part of His plan. We sometimes call our jobs our living, our livelihoods. And this sums it up, doesn't it? The danger of our job being our life. And is God bigger than your career, or is your career bigger than God? Is He more important? So that's the first lie we tell ourselves. I am what I do. Secondly, I am how I feel. The second thing that makes up our identities is how we feel. Have you felt pretty down this week? I have. Have you felt pretty confused this week? I have too. Confused? Yeah, me too. And I'm sure Moses had felt all these emotions over his time in the desert, in the wilderness. He went from being a part of the royal family in Egypt to being a shepherd in the middle of nowhere. I'm sure he felt a whole array of emotions. But once again, he was not to be defined by how he felt. You see, this isn't our identity. Moses felt scared of the prospect of seeing the world's most powerful man. And yet that wasn't important. We are not defined by how we feel at one given moment. This is our true identity. Listen to this from Luke's Gospel. Jesus says this, "So I say to you, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock on the door and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks the door will be opened." In Philippians 4 and verse 19 it says this, "And my God will meet all your needs according to the riches of the glory in Christ Jesus." Or in 1 John 3, "See what great love the Father has lavished on us, that we should be called children of God." That is who we are. It doesn't change dependent on how we feel, whether God feels far away or whether He feels near. These things are true of us if we are Christians. None of these are dependent on our fleeting emotions or on our circumstances. They're true because of what Jesus has done. We thought of that on Sunday, didn't we? It's not about how we feel on the plane, it's about the plane itself, isn't it? That was a helpful reminder, and it's true today still, isn't it? We are not how we feel. And thirdly, I am in control. That's the third lie. Moses didn't feel in control. God said that He would bring the people out of Egypt. And in verse 11, Moses says, I can't do that. I don't have that sort of control, he's thinking. When we were growing up, we often played on our games console, on our Xbox. And when Mum asked us to make sure that our youngest brother was allowed to play, what we would do is we would give him a controller, but not plug it in. So he would enjoy the experience of playing along without being in control, and he was none the wiser for what we were doing to him. But as he grew older, he realised that he wasn't actually in control of what he was doing. And maybe you've had that same experience this week. You've realised how little control you actually have. I can't decide, I'm not allowed to decide whether I leave the house or not, let alone make the big decisions. We have realised we don't know what tomorrow brings. We feel totally out of control, out of our depth. But were you in control before then? You might have thought you were. In many ways, I'm sure you're glad in some ways that you don't have more control. We think of world leaders like Donald Trump and Boris Johnson. They have power and control in some way, but they still feel completely out of their depth. They're as confused as any of us. You see, none of us here really have control. I'm sure Moses looked at Pharaoh and he thought, now he has control. But God would show him soon enough that he didn't really have control. God is in control. In Isaiah we're told, so do not fear, for I am with you. This is God speaking. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. Or these words from Psalm 33. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people he chose for his inheritance. From heaven the Lord looks down and sees all mankind. From his dwelling place he watches all who live on earth. He who forms the hearts of all, who considers everything they do. No king is saved by the size of his army. No warrior escapes by his great strength. A horse is a vain hope for deliverance. Despite all its great strength, it cannot save. But the eyes of the Lord are on those who fear him, and those who hope is in his unfailing love, to deliver them from death and keep them alive in famine. We wait and hope for the Lord. He is our help and our shield. In him our hearts rejoice, for we trust in his holy name. May your unfailing love be with us, Lord, even as we put our hope in you. You see, God is in control. You are not. He is wise. You are not. He is good. You are not. He is all-loving. You are not. He is just. You are not. He is unchanging. You are not. You know, it's a good thing that he is in control and we are not. It's a good thing. So 3 lies. I am what I do. I am what I feel. And I am in control. But what about God? Who is he? So we've looked at the identity of man. What is the identity of God? The powerful and personal nature of God is shown in a burning bush. Fire is something that is both terrifying and inviting. It's warm to stand by, but it will kill you if you get too near. It's both these things, powerful and inviting. Lovely to stand by, but don't get too close. And this is God, isn't it? If you wanted to speak like a posh theologian, if you wanted to use long words just to be clever, the words you would use are transcendent and immanent. Transcendent means that God is greater than anything else that we can possibly imagine. He is the ruler, the creator, the sustainer of the whole universe. He is above it all. But he's also immanent. I-M-M-A-N-E-N-T. There are lots of different words that sound like immanent. But this is I-M-M. Involved in the world. He doesn't stay far away. He is involved in the lives of those he created. It's where we get the word Emmanuel from, which means God is with us. You see, God chose to step into our world, didn't he? To show that he was both transcendent and immanent. The God of the Bible is both those things. In the Quran you have Allah, who is transcendent but distant. He shows power but no love. You have no assurance of faith because you fear him and you don't know what he thinks of you. He is cold and distant and far away. But in Eastern religions like Hinduism and Buddhism, you have an immanent God. God is near because God is everything and he is everyone. The cows are gods, the sky is God, the trees are God, you are God, he's inside you. You see, both things are wrong. Only in Christianity do you have this true faith, this perfect blend of immanence and transcendence. A powerful God worthy of praise who stoops low to be with his people. The true God. So we've looked at the I ams of the human condition, but what about God? In this passage we have Moses asking that question. The question that the whole Bible is written to explain. Who is God? That's what the Bible's all about. Who is God? And Moses asks, who are you? Who should I say has called me when I go to speak in Egypt? And the answer he gets, I am who I am. I am sent you. Imagine you called someone on the phone and they asked, Who's ringing, sorry? You said, I am. They would hang up, I'm sure. But in this we see so much of who God truly is. It shows he is outside of time. God is eternal. He is everlasting. Even if this Pharaoh had been in charge for many years and his family had been a dynasty that had had their history in Egypt, even if this country was the oldest civilization in the whole world, it's nothing compared to God. God had been there before the first brick of the pyramids had been laid. He'd been ruling before Pharaoh was even in nappies. He had been ruling since before this world was created. You see, he didn't have a beginning. That blows our minds, and it's supposed to blow our minds. We will never quite get that. Everything we know has a beginning, but God doesn't. Ephesians tells us this: Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us in Christ with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly realms, for he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, to be holy and blameless in his presence. That's amazing, isn't it? And Jesus, when he walked the earth, he said this: Before Abraham was, I am. And when he said this to the people, they picked up stones and they threw it at him, because they were reminded of the words that God spoke from the burning bush. They knew that it meant that he was calling himself God. That's why they tried to kill him. It shows he's outside of time. We can't constrain him in the same ways as we think of time. It also shows that he's self-existent. Who made God? It's a question two types of people ask. Who made God? Sunday school kids ask, who made God? And atheist philosophers who think they're clever ask, who made God? That's one thing about God that they don't get. Who made him? Well, that's the amazing thing about God, isn't it? That's one of the things that makes him God. No one made him. He wasn't made by anyone or anything. He is. I am. He doesn't say I was. No, he says I am. He didn't need anyone else to create him. He has always been. He's also self-sufficient. The bush was burning, and yet the bush wasn't being consumed by the fire. Fires need fuel to keep burning. I was going to ask Ben and Steve to confirm this for me, but I'm sure my GCSE science is still true that you need fuel to make a fire. And yet this fire didn't. Unlike Moses or even Pharaoh, God doesn't need anything in order to survive. And that's shown in the fact that the bush doesn't need, the flame doesn't need the bush to burn. He doesn't need food or energy. He doesn't need armies to protect him. He doesn't need air to breathe. He exists whether we are there or whether we're not. He is self-sufficient. And he's also unchanging. God is unchanging. As we've seen in the first couple of sermons in this series on the life of Moses, an important thing that gets repeated time and time again is that this is the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. Moses knew that despite hundreds of years passing by, he was still speaking to the same God as his forefathers spoke to. He was listening to a God who doesn't change. Jesus Christ, it says in Hebrews, is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Or as it says in James, every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. In these comparisons, you see, we might be frail, we might be changing, but God doesn't change. We've seen the frailty of people and the awesomeness of God. Moses feels humble, he feels weak, he feels helpless, daunted by the task, but he is reassured by the very same God who was with his forefathers. He says to Moses, I am with you. That's the amazing thing. God, despite his might and strength, chooses to show his power while using us, while using his people. Look at verse 20. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do in it. And after that he will let you go. And I will give this people favour in the sight of the Egyptians. And when you go, you shall not go empty, but each woman shall ask of her neighbour, and any woman who lives in a house, for silver and gold, jewellery and for clothing. You shall put them on your sons and on your daughters, so you shall plunder the Egyptians. You shall plunder the Egyptians. God choosing to use frail people in order to complete his perfect plan. A sentence we hear time and time again in the Old Testament is, I am the God who brought you out of Egypt. It was a reminder for the people who were listening that this was how mighty he was. The people of Israel needed to be reminded that this was what God was able to achieve. This is the God who listens to the groans of his people, who sees their pain, who acknowledges their bondage and does something about it. He frees them. He gives them this deliverer, and he leads them to this promised land, a land of milk and honey. So rest and be comforted today by knowing the same God. This is the same God that we're looking at today. So as you have more time than ever before to maybe think these things through, maybe you found it difficult having all this time to think, well, remember, you are not your job. You are not how you feel. You are not in control, thank goodness. Instead, think of these things. You are a child adopted into God's family, and you get to call him Father. Even if you feel terrible, even if you feel confused, even if you feel down, you are assured of an eternity with God in glory where those feelings will never return. Those feelings of anxiety and worry and confusion, they won't be there. You know that the only one for today, the only one who is good and glorious is in control today. So let's remember that as we go about this week. This is the eternal, unchanging, all-powerful God who moved mightily in the past to bring the people of God out of Egypt, and he continues to move today. He is working. He is the God who brought them out of Egypt. He is the great I am, and he is the God that is bigger than any pandemic. He is the God that we worship today. So in your groups, I don't know when you're listening to this, but when you gather together in your groups on Wednesday night, why don't you discuss with one another before you pray? Was there anything that struck you afresh today? What does the passage show you about the character or attributes of God? And lastly, how can you apply these things to your life, even this week? God bless.